Know what LK-99 is? It's all the buzz now in the technology space because this could be as powerful as the transistor was to our current world.
That's bullshit.
But it's possible, though, they may not remember any of that. In fact, all of that may be a footnote to what is happening right now, with possibly one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of the 21st century.
That is especially bullshit.
The bigger the claim, the more we have to be skeptical. So what's really going on? Is it really legitimate? And what could this mean? Let's figure this out together. I'm Ricky, and this is 2-Bit Da Vinci.
And why anyone would watch a guy with zero understanding of the subject to figure it out together, let alone over 1 million people, is beyond me. Especially as he is 100% clueless as to why, even if this were a room temperature superconductor, it would change nothing. Teaser time. Everything Ricky is saying here is wrong.
Machines, but with room temperature superconductors, system design would be simplified dramatically, and MRI machines' upfront and operational cost would be slashed significantly. Imagine medicine game changer. How about nuclear fusion reactors? Again, the high energy plasma that is produced has to be confined, which is currently done with superconductors, and again at very low temperatures. This energy input to keep that superconductor material cold could be made away with in a world with room temperature superconductor. The Meissner effect would even allow for ultra-efficient, low-cost maglev trains like we mentioned before. How about ultra-efficient electric vehicles that don't need battery or motor cooling? So might we be on the brink of a whole new industry of room temperature superconductor batteries?
No, the only person who might even entertain a concept like that would be someone who has no understanding of batteries, energy storage, or conductivity.
That's a video all by itself for another day. But by far, the most fascinating application has to do with the fundamental research Suk-Bae Lee was working on at Q Center, and that's quantum computers.
So why was he wrong about everything he said there?
Let's figure this out together.
So here I have a brand new room temperature superconductor that's going to change everything.
Now, this latest breakthrough that we're talking about today from Korea claims that it works not just at room temperature, but at atmospheric pressure. That is a double game changer.
So every day when I come in, I come past the lunar module and the trilobite with the weird eyes and this thing, which it's like, is that actually levitating? Is that actually levitating?
The team of researchers actually managed to make a coin-sized sample levitate, well, sort of, on top of a powerful permanent magnet. Here's actual video footage of the authors playing with the little sample, and you can see that there is definitely something pushing up. But is it floating? I'll let you be the judge of that.
And you get in, and it's like, my God, it's levitating. It's a room temperature superconductor. That's incredible.
If this turns out to be real, this is an automatic Nobel Prize. They have it locked up.
It's like, my God, look at it levitating. That's incredible. Except this one's not made out of toxic lead, but harmless carbon. I mean, just look at it levitating there. And just so we're clear, it's been floating like this on these not that super strong magnets for years. So how come I'm not instantly going to get the Nobel Prize? And why didn't this change everything? So before we get on to why these claims are probably bullshit, let's cut to the core of why, even if they're real, it will change nothing. Or at best, almost nothing. And you don't have to know a lot to realize why it's all bullshit. Some 30 years ago, before I even did my PhD, I did an undergraduate. And in that undergraduate, I made, as part of one of the routine practical courses, some high-temperature superconductor. It wasn't particularly hard to do. You just mix up the various oxides or whatever, press them into a pellet, and cook them at a high temperature for a day or so. So why, if we've had high-temperature superconductors for some 30 years that work at liquid nitrogen temperatures, with liquid nitrogen these days being comparatively cheap and easy to come by, why do places like the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor and the Large Hadron Collider make their superconducting magnets out of stuff that superconducts at liquid helium temperatures? And why are virtually all MRI machines made out of the same stuff?
How about nuclear fusion reactors? Again, done with superconductors, and again at very low temperatures. This energy input to keep that superconductor material cold could be made away with in a world with room temperature superconductors.
Yeah, we've had high temperature superconductors for some 30 years that run at relatively cheap liquid nitrogen temperatures. So why are we still using super expensive liquid helium cooled superconductors? With ballpark figures, liquid nitrogen clocking in at about 1/10 of the cost of Coke, with liquid helium coming in about the price of wine. Well, the main reason is that high temperature superconductors, which are typically ceramics, have properties akin to bricks. And it's actually kind of hard to make wires out of stuff with the properties of bricks. You know, even if you could get them into a long form factor, they tend to crack. And what's the new high temperature superconductor? It's a ceramic. And thermal expansion on thin ceramic wires is a nightmare to deal with. You know, there's a reason why our high power lines droop like that.
We also mentioned power distribution, right? That's another one. Let us know in the comments below if there are other conditions where a room temperature superconductor would be completely game changing.
So you see, inventing a superconductor that has mechanical properties of a brick has basically zero applications. They're ceramic, hard to work with, and that's why all of the big applications use liquid helium-cooled superconductors, because they're made out of conventional metal wire. The bottom line is, 30 years ago, we had these high-temperature superconductors, and there's basically no use for them. Well, that's not entirely true now, but that took 30 years, and as you'll see, the applications for these things are still relatively niche. But when this be able to make free, levitating, high-speed trains a thing?
The Meissner effect would even allow for ultra-efficient, low-cost maglev trains like we mentioned before.
No, it won't, for the bloody obvious reason that even if you get your superconducting magnets and your levitation for free, so what? Now all you have to do is build a multi-billion-dollar track, which will still take decades to complete. Honestly, compared to the costs of construction, cooling versus non-cooling the magnets would be chump change. Which brings us on to my amazing superconductor. Okay, I've not been entirely honest. This is pyrolytic graphite, readily available online, which will quite happily levitate on magnets because of something called diamagnetism. You'll also notice that it levitates on really quite small magnets, rather than the sort of magnets that they have here, which are the sort of thing that you can use to lift a car with. Yeah, this looks about right. Yeah, it's like 10 centimeters, that sort of thing, with a 300 kilogram hold on it. That's pretty strong. But it does highlight one of the problems that, you know, even if you've got something that levitates for free, it's not an infinitely strong force. The force that levitates magnets in superconductors due to the Meissner effect is not infinitely strong. But again, you know, if your wires are made out of a ceramic and you overstress them and they crack, you lose everything. You're gonna have a bad time.
How would this actually change your life on a day-to-day basis? So one of the things that would change your life is, of course, faster trains. Now, this isn't going to be trains that are just slightly faster, but this would be trains that are exponentially faster than what we currently do have.
Yeah, even if that were true, it's still going to take 20 years to build it. And it's not going to be that much more efficient. Roll resistance on trains is already pretty minimal, and that's the only bit that you're going to save. The air resistance will be exactly the same.
How about ultra-efficient electric vehicles that don't need battery or motor cooling?
Hyper-efficient electric motors. Again, not really the game changer you might think. I mean, electric motors are already some 90% efficient, so at best you're going to be tweaking the efficiency. In the, you know, superconducting motors or not, you're still going to have to deal with frictional losses. And again, you would still have to make wires out of this ceramic, which is one of the reasons why making electric motors or generators out of superconductors is something that is still basically only done on an experimental basis. So even if a room temperature superconductor is real, why would you expect it to change anything when previous high temperature superconductors some 30 years ago didn't? In any event, it's not real. I mean, what's this new magical superconductor meant to be made out of? It's basically mostly lead phosphate with a little bit of copper doped in there. And what are the properties of lead phosphate? That would be lead apatite. Well, the closest thing you're probably going to get to it is calcium apatite. Yeah, that's what your teeth are basically made of. It's fairly robust stuff to be sure, but if someone told you that teeth were superconducting, would it really change anything? Well, maybe if you were labouring under the delusions that lead wasn't actually fairly toxic. Or you thought it would be trivial to make wires out of ceramics.
So at this point, you've got to be wondering, what's the catch? Rare materials? Complex processes? Toxic chemicals? No.
Look, I get it. I've been a research chemist for some 30 years. Probably fair to say I've picked up a thing or two along the way that wouldn't be considered general knowledge.
And what about joints? Can you connect two pieces of LK-99 and have the superconductivity pass from one to the other? Or does it have to be one constant solid piece? These are things we just don't know yet.
No, these are things that we've known for 30 years. Making wires out of ceramics is basically impossible. It doesn't suddenly become a mystery because you found a new ceramic.
These are things we just don't know yet.
As is joining ceramic wires. You don't need a PhD in chemistry to realize that ceramics are brittle. So yeah, even if this is completely legit, even if, it'll change nothing, which is one of the reasons why I've not gone into the details of the paper. The material properties alone kill this thing dead. But material properties ain't the only thing you've got to worry about. Superconductors aren't magic. It's not like, boom, superconductor, now you can do anything. They have maximum currents, above which point they break down and get resistance again, which is really bad if you're relying on those superconducting properties to, say, not crash a train or something. So from an engineering perspective, you don't want to go too near those thresholds. Because you go above them and you'll basically burn out your magnet. And yes, those critical currents are temperature dependent. So even if you had something that was superconducting at room temperature, it may well be that it wouldn't have terribly useful properties unless you cool it down to, say, liquid helium temperatures. And even if you can overcome all of that, now you have to turn this thing into a commercial product where your chief enemy will be fabrication costs. Lead is toxic, but fairly available, and phosphate is certainly fairly readily available. But so is carbon. And you know what? Even though carbon is cheap, diamonds, which have very good hardness and thermal properties, and are made out of the exact same carbon that the graphite is, are not cheap. And the chief reason is fabrication costs.
So at this point, you've got to be wondering, what's the catch? Rare materials? Complex processes? Toxic chemicals? No.
You take a look at the existing methods of turning ceramic superconductors into a product of some sort, and you can immediately see why this has always remained a niche. They revolve around things like chemical vapor deposition, one of the methods used to make diamonds, or powder in a tube method, where you put your ceramic into a silver tube and then roll it into a tape. And yes, this does mean that your wires are now made out of mostly silver. And your superconductor, which is embedded in this ribbon, is about the thickness of 2 human hairs. And seeing as how much current these things can take depends on how thick they are, about the thickness of a human hair ain't ideal. Then, of course, you've got to cool it down to liquid nitrogen temperatures for these things to work. But you have to cool it much more to get good performance out of it. Look, I'm not cynical about this sort of stuff just for the sake of being cynical. I'm cynical because I've watched this field for some 30 years, all the time with the promising future applications of high-performance smart grid, electric power transmission, transformers, power storage devices, compact fusion, blah, blah, blah. And still, here we are 30 years on, where the commercial applications so far for high-temperature superconductors have been very limited. Would I support funding research in a field like this? Well, yeah, probably. You can study things because they're interesting. And sometimes that does actually lead on to stuff that you can use in reality. But I also recognize that this is a mature field, where all the obvious stuff was tried decades ago.
I honestly think this will spark a new wave of research, and before long, we'll have tens, if not hundreds, of new ambient superconductors for all sorts of applications.
Something that is, at best, just superconducting at room temperature, made out of something with the material properties of teeth, would change none of this. And that's assuming it's real. So why ain't it real? Now you gotta understand a little about various fields of research here. There are things like drug research, which is basically so hard to try and design a drug to do something because the systems are so complicated that it's actually more cost effective to just test everything and hope you find something that works. And if you do find something that works, it's boom, Viagra time, and you become rich. But it does just involve a whole lot of trial and error to find that. It's the sort of scientific equivalent of buying a lottery ticket. Now, in my experience, superconductivity research is a similar field, in that no one really understands the causes of it. Well, to the extent where you can actually design a superconductor. So a lot of the research is just mixing up lots of weird stuff, cooking it in a furnace for about a week at 1,000 degrees Celsius, and seeing what its properties are like. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at the most well-known of the high-temperature superconductors. Yeah, the one I made as an undergraduate some 30 years ago. Yttrium barium copper oxide. Even as a chemist, copper oxide is black brick dust, and you're blending it with yttrium, an element that you almost never use, and barium. No sane man would mix these three chemicals together. And then there are whole families of these things discovered, mostly involving copper oxides of one sort or another, and it's notable that they all have lots of obscure heavy atoms in there. And notably, none of them contain phosphorus or lead. Okay, I partially tell a lie. Technically, there's lanthanum oxy iron phosphide with its superconducting at liquid helium temperatures. Okay, let's leave it at there are no superconductors that contain phosphate. That's like a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens. And while there are no real mixtures that contain lead that are superconducting, lead, the pure metal, is actually superconducting at low temperatures. But that's the pure metal. But just because no one's discovered a superconductor that contains phosphate, that doesn't mean that they can't exist. Right? Well, yeah, but like I was saying, my experience of superconductor synthesis research is it's not particularly inspired stuff. So my expectation is these great armies of people doing superconductor research have covered all of the simple stuff, like variants of lead apatite years ago. Have I poured through the literature to verify this? Hell no. Look, this is an immensely boring field of research, and the idea is dead on arrival for half a dozen different reasons before whether you come to whether people have studied lead phosphate's conductivity years ago. For me, I'm just happy to say that the field that discovered mercury, thallium, barium, calcium, copper oxide, and strontium fluoro iron arsenic probably tried lead phosphate at some point. Look, in my life, there have been several fields that promised great things, but ultimately delivered nothing. These are things that I learned about in my undergraduate that decades on are still making the same claims without really showing anything in the way of progress. High temperature superconductors is one of those fields. Ionic liquids is another. Quantum computing is another. But only if we could get a guy who doesn't understand anything about either quantum computing or superconductors to tell us how one will revolutionize the other.
By far, the most fascinating application has to do with the fundamental research Suk-Bae Lee was working on at Q Center, and that's quantum computers. If you've ever seen a picture of a quantum computer in all its glory, it is a really beautiful machine. It would be one of the biggest game changers, and it would allow a world where we could have quantum computers on our phones and our laptops.
Yeah, like I was saying, quantum computing is another one of those fields where I've seen lectures on these things for decades, always promising the Earth, and I just point you to the wiki page. There's a Nature Spotlight article summarizing current quantum computers as being, for now, good for absolutely nothing. And other things such as how it concluded that a large range of potential applications is considered, such as machine learning, will not achieve quantum advantage with current quantum algorithms in the foreseeable future. but sure, you'll run games on them somehow.
In addition, superconductors would bring some amazing changes to the world of computers, making them super duper computers. Thing you do on your computer would feel instant. Whether you're browsing the internet, or playing games, or running complex applications, everything would happen in a flash.
Or we could have quantum computers on our phones and our laptops.
In addition, imagine playing your favorite video game with graphics so realistic and so smooth. With superconductor computers, games would run at their highest settings without any lag.
Now, I'm actually a pretty experienced scientist, but superconductors is not my comfort zone. So take all of this with a grain of salt from a sort of informed observer's view of a superconductor. Now, from the wiki page, it says there are two types of superconductor that are conventional, or that follow the rules, or unconventional, that not so much. That science speak for this is not as simple a phenomena as you might want it to be. So what I can tell you is that all solid stuff in motion has certain modes of vibration. Think synchronized pendulums. In condensed matter, liquids and solids and that sort of thing, these are called phonons, and they basically consist of the vibrations of the heavy things, the nuclei, and the strongly bound electrons. Basically the atoms. So what might this look like in practice? So what you've got here is a molecular dynamics simulation of a sodium chloride crystal. Chloride's in green, sodium's in purple. And the rough dimensions that you're looking at here, this is a sort of billionth of a meter, that sort of thing. And the timescales you're looking at are about a trillionth of a second. And if I have this at about 800 degrees Celsius, this is just below the melting point. You see, the crystal wobbles quite a lot, and obviously once it wobbles enough that these guys can sort of pop out of their crystal structure, that's basically what melting is. And you'll notice there are various characteristic frequencies of these wobbles here. Those are the phonons. And if I reduce the temperature of this from 800 degrees, that's basically red hot, to a few hundred, enough to burn yourself, it looks like this. It's a lot less wobbly than it used to be. And if I freeze it down to sort of liquid nitrogen temperatures, it looks like this. A very, very sedentary wobble on this. Now, simulations like this basically assume the atoms are hard spheres with charge on them. Positive for the sodium, negative for the chloride, which is actually a pretty good approximation for these things. And I can run simulations like this fairly cheaply on a desktop. If I wanted to do a similar sized simulation on a similar timescale, but for a metal which does have conduction band electrons, the most powerful supercomputers on the planet couldn't hack it. Nonetheless, we still know there are similar characteristic vibrations of the conduction band electrons called plasmons. And the two interact with each other such that in a sort of thermal equilibrium. That is, if you put surplus energy into the electrons, like a current, it'll eventually couple and end up thermalizing with the structure. This is like two tanks of water. You know, they're sat together in thermal equilibrium, and if you put energy into one of them and then leave it, eventually, as the two tanks are in thermal contact, the temperature will bleed across to the other and the two tanks will have the same energy again. But what if you could actually separate the tanks? Now there is no coupling between the two. The hot tank remains hot and the cold tank remains cold. So this is what a conventional conductor would look like, where if you put energy into the velocity of the electrons, eventually it couples with the structure of the material, just heating everything up to a constant temperature. Whereas with the superconductor, you don't get coupling between the two. So you can actually put energy into the velocity of the electrons and it doesn't couple with the structure of the material. That is, you can have effectively different temperatures for the electrons and the solid. That would be the electrons are moving without coupling with the atoms. Forever. This is a nice explanation of why superconductivity only happens when things tend to get cold, because you're slowing down the phonons. Because only at low temperatures do these things not couple. So what's probably going on with the superconductivity, if I had to guess? Yeah, obviously the crystal structure will be very different from this, but it's basically the same deal. It's a sort of repeating structure. What you're probably going to be looking at is, I'm just going to hide the sodiums for a bit, is you will, when you freeze it down, some certain aspect of the crystal structure will become a lot more rigid than the others. And when it does that, these modes no longer couple very well with the electrons, and so the electrons can basically move without coupling to the structure on certain axes in these ceramics, which, if I had to guess, is basically the reason why certain structures are very good for high temperature superconductors, with phosphate conspicuously not being one of them. Then you come to the conclusion of the paper. And I'm like, what planet have you guys been on for the last 30 years? So you scroll past the pictures where it's clearly a melted piece of ceramic and down to the conclusions, where it says the LK-99 is a very useful material for the study of superconductivity puzzles at room temperature. Superconductivity puzzles? All evidence and explanation lead that LK-99 is the first room temperature and ambient pressure superconductor. Aha! The LK-99 has many possibilities for various applications such as magnet, no. Motor, no. Cable, no. Levitation train, no. Power cable, hang on, power cable and cable? Okay, no. Qubit for quantum computer, no. Terahertz antenna, and so on. We believe that our new development will be a brand new historical event that opens a new era for humankind. And it's like, how delusional are these people? I mean, you make an argument that this guy has an excuse and that he's just some guy who makes vapid videos on YouTube. You know, where you wouldn't even bother checking things on Wikipedia or something.
Lee and his team were only able to reach 400 degrees because their equipment couldn't go any further. Can you imagine the industrial applications of a superconductor working at over 400 degrees Kelvin would have?
Okay, let me take that back. 400 Kelvin is only just above the temperature of boiling water.
Only able to reach 400 degrees because their equipment couldn't go any further.
And he says they don't have the ability to make something slightly hotter than boiling water. Like, say for instance, using a hot plate. He really thinks that they had this world-shattering research and no one thought, hey, if we're going to write a paper that's going to change the world forever, maybe we should invest in $100 or so hot plate or borrow this exceptionally common piece of equipment to measure what temperature it actually stops being superconducting at.
Only able to reach 400 degrees because their equipment couldn't go any further.
But he's arguably got an excuse for not knowing this stuff because reasons. You're meant to be superconductor researchers who have been doing this sort of thing for years. How can you not know that a block of ceramic is useless for basically all of these things? And stepping back from the hyperventilating, this changes everything crowd, this was your scientific breath of reality for the day. And if you found this breath of sanity refreshing, please feel free to share it with a friend, or drop a like on the video, or maybe support this channel directly through Patreon. And thanks for watching.